Hello everyone. For this video I've decided to rank the studio albums by a band I've collected the main album catalog of, and I decided to start with the Kinks. While considered one of the big four of the British invasion of the 60s, the Kinks tend to get overlooked by a lot of listeners my age when they delve into this era of classic rock, outside of a few of their most well-known songs, of course. But me, I'm not merely a listener, I'm a collector. If I really like a band or artist, I track down and buy what I consider their main catalog of material, usually their studio recorded output, though sometimes I include some live material. During my college days I began buying albums by the Kinks, and about a year after I graduated college I had them all. Some were easier to get a hold of than others. So without further ado, here's my rankings. And this is just their main album releases. You won't see the Great Lost Kinks album compilation on here, even though I have all their tracks from that. Nor will you find To the Bone, which is more of a collection of their songs in unplugged format, which was popular in the mid-90s, with only a couple of songs that were new at the time on that album. And I'd like to emphasize that this is my opinion, not yours, so don't get upset if I rank something different than how you would. Coming at number 24, UK Jive. Forgettable is how I describe this. Very few of the tracks actually stand out. The most notable one, Down All the Days to 1992, is really only notable because, well, a lot of bands and artists at the time seemed to have some weird, unexplained sense of optimism about the early 90s. One other example, part-time Electric Light Orchestra band member Dave Morgan was throwing his optimism around in music as early as the mid-80s. Anyway, this was the last album the band would release as a 5-piece. Number 23, The Kinks Present a Soap Opera. While this one has a few enjoyable tunes, including the hilarious Ducks on the Wall, it's one of the band's weakest albums. At some points, it doesn't even sound like the Kinks, even on the most acclaimed album track, Holiday Romance. I think this would have worked better as a Ray Davies solo album. It originated as a soundtrack for a TV teleplay that never got produced. Number 22, Kinda Kinks. This album is proof that good ideas can be botched by poor execution. The songwriting on the original tunes is a lot better than it was on the band's debut album, and it rocks pretty good, but the production was just so badly rushed that it almost hurts to listen to parts of it. Still, there's plenty of signs on this album of what was to come. Number 21, Kinks. As I mentioned in my Big Four editorial a few years back, the biggest problem with this album is that it was so rushed in production. Some of the songs needed more polish, and some of the songs could have benefited from more time to refine the lyrics a little bit. Plus, it feels like the band is pulling in several stylistic directions at once. But it's not a horrible album by any means, and it did, after all, contain their most enduring hit, You Really Got Me. Number 20, Think Visual. This one would probably be more memorable for me if I had a good quality copy of it on CD. As it is, there's not much to remember about it. In fact, I just found out while writing this that it was originally planned to be a concept album. Dave Davies provides the best song overall with Rock and Roll Cities. Number 19, Preservation, Act 2. Honestly, Act 2 suffers from the opposite problem Act 1 does. There's too much story here. And that's mostly due to their record label forcing Ray Davies to condense what was supposed to be Acts 2 and 3 into one album. Unfortunately, not many of the songs here will be great as standalone pieces outside of the rock opera's concept. If you look hard enough, though, you'll find a few gems here. Number 18, Preservation, Act 1. I get that Ray Davies was using Act 1 to establish the characters and narrative, but this album barely holds its story together. That being said, a lot of the tunes here would have worked well as standalone pieces on a more conventional album, and the expanded lineup of backing vocalists and brass musicians don't detract from the band's overall sound like they would on Act 2. Number 17, Phobia. If there's one way I can describe this album, it's that it's way too long, but I still like a few of the songs that are on it. They probably should have cut the album in two and released it as two separate LPs. It was their last full album, released about 3 years before the band officially split. Number 16, The Kink Controversy. While this album got the level of care and attention that its predecessors deserved, Ray Davies' songwriting was clearly still maturing. Musically, it's more of the same of what listeners got on the last two albums, but it showed a lot of promise. Number 15, Everybody's in Showbiz. Despite heralding the musical direction that would follow on the next 3 albums, Showbiz has a nice spread of songs on its studio half, and the live stuff's not bad either. The fact that this is a concept album and not a full rock opera is the saving grace, since it allows the studio-recorded songs to shine better individually. Number 14, Misfits. This one's an interesting collection of tunes. Not one of my personal favorites, but it still has a lot of great songs, both among the serious and more humorous ends. It came at a turbulent point for the band, as they would end up losing their new bassist, as well as longtime keyboardist John Gosling. Number 13, Word of Mouth. The last album of theirs to generate relatively noteworthy songs in Do It Again and Living on a Thin Line, this album deserves more recognition than it gets. Granted, some of the sound production makes the album feel slightly unfinished in places, but when the music shines, it really shines. Number 12, Percy. Despite the sensitive subject matter of the film it's the soundtrack for, I've read from people who've seen the movie that the music doesn't really match up, which is fine by me, since despite some of the pieces only being minute-long snippets, there are some underrated gems on this album. It's a shame that this is a bit of an obscurity in their overall discography. Number 11, Low Budget. The first of their later period albums that I picked up, I like this one a lot. Some of the songs center on the late 70s energy crisis, and 1 or 2 of them are still semi-relevant today. Not a single weak song to be had on this album, and it did pretty well with the critics on release. Number 10, Sleepwalker. The first of their post-theatrical era albums, and a solid piece of work. A push from their new record bosses at Arista forced this change on the band, and it turned out to be a good change. I dare say that this album shows better examples of Ray Davies' slice-of-life character sketch songs than most of the band's earlier 70s output. Number 9, State of Confusion. For an album that came at the start of the band's final, well over a decade-long decline, this album's pretty good outside of the song Young Conservatives. Even the bonus tracks on my CD copy are awesome. This album included the band's last big hit, the nostalgia-fueled Come Dancing. Number 8, Give the People What They Want. I'd say this is a near-perfect album, with Art Lover and A Little Bit of Abuse being the only real duds to my ears. It's easily the best, in my opinion, of the band's post-theatrical era albums. Number 7, The Kinks present Schoolboys in Disgrace. This was the last of the band's rock operas, and most critics are pretty dismissive of it. Personally, though, I really like it. It tells a concise story while forecasting the band's turn towards a more, well, arena rock style. My only real complaint, the album is way too short. I honestly once listened to the whole thing almost twice over while driving across town to get White Castle and back to campus during my college days. Number 6, Arthur, or the Decline and Fall of the British Empire. Their first rock opera, coming on the heels of greats such as The Who's Tommy and the Pretty Things' SF Sorrow. There are points on this album that come off as a little too poppy, but the story's easy enough to follow and even makes a few good social commentaries along the way. Really, the fact that this album sounds so 60s Britpop at a point where other bands were going harder and edgier in their sound is both the album's biggest weak point and its biggest appeal. Number 5, Muswell Hillbillies. Truly, this is the most underrated album in the band's catalog, and it was their first for RCA Records. The band's return to touring in the United States following a half-decade ban clearly rubbed off here, since it's an all-Americana sound, which is what makes the album so appealing to me. It sounds so close to home, and yet there's some distinct Britishness in some of the lyrics, such as on Have a Cup of Tea. I call this one essential listening for anyone who wants to explore the band's discography a little more than just the hits. Number 4, Something Else by the Kinks. With the band in the midst of their ban from touring in the US, their music had become more and more distinctly British. And the British pop sound they'd have in the late 60s is in full swing here. I think that's what makes this album so appealing. Other bands like Cream, Led Zeppelin, and Black Sabbath would be presenting harder sounds, and others like the Rolling Stones would be re-immersing themselves in their roots after experimenting with psychedelia. This made the Kinks sound anachronistic, but delightfully so. Number 3, Face to Face. Despite a lukewarm reception on release, I'd say this album is their first true classic. It featured increasing use of Ray Davies' character sketch songwriting style, and struck a solid balance between the Baroque pop they'd go on to do on their next several releases, and the hodgepodge of mid-60s rock and beat styles that they'd had before. I highly recommend this album. Number 2, the Kinks are the Village Green Preservation Society. Considered by most fans and critics as their best album, it would be criminal not to rank it high, even if it isn't my overall favorite. It's a quintessential bit of British pop, even going into Baroque pop territory on some tracks. Not much on the album rocks a lot, but I'd call this album a must-listen for any fans of 60s pop and rock. It also marked the beginning of a new era in the band's history as they embarked on a long string of concept albums, rock operas, and soundtracks. Number 1. Lola vs. Power Man and the Money Go Round, Part 1. While critics usually keep this one from reaching the top 5 in the rankings, I think it deserves this lofty spot. It's one of their best concept albums, all about disillusionment with the music industry. Not a weak song to be heard here, and for all its lyrical bite, a lot of the musical arrangements are gentle and subdued enough that it's not overwhelming. Well, that's my rankings for all 24 of the Kinks' main studio albums. I'll have more music-related content coming soon. Thank you.